If you're coming into a consulting engagement and you're not ready to turn it into action, you're just not going to see the results of it. So there has to be some kind of attitude of action in order for us to be successful on either side.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm joined today by the one and only Carson Pierce. Thanks for being here, Carson.
Hey, glad to be back. Always fun.
It's good to see you. You're tuning in from our nation's capital in Ottawa, Ontario.
I think I was here last.
Ottawa.
Yeah, I think I was here last time we did this. You're a little closer now, though. You're just down the road in Montreal.
I am. I'm waiting for you to arrive this week for our company offsite. Eagerly awaiting. We're going to go watch Canadians and Maple Leafs at the Bell Center at an NHL game, which is like the most Canadian thing we could possibly do for our company offsite. So I'm fired up.
Yeah, one big glass of maple syrup while we watch.
It's going to be great. A couple poutines in the stands, going to get eaten. Maybe a beaver tail if we're feeling adventurous. But with all of that, I'm really excited for today's episode because we're doing something we've never done before, which is walking through a client engagement that we did, in particular an assessment, which is one of the things that we do with all of our clients when we first start working with them. Of course, anonymizing this client because the blessing and the curse of what we do is clients, are trusting us with a lot of very sensitive information about their business. So you're not going to know who the client is, but we will walk through, just what problems they had when they came in, what we did to figure out what was going on, the outcomes that we got to. So I'm really looking forward to this, Carson, and I appreciate you doing all the prep work to do this for us today.
Yeah, no problem. And I mean, this particular situation is unique. They're always unique. On our last podcast, we were talking about some example, and I met with a client afterwards and like, were you talking about us? And I was like, no, it wasn't you, but every problem is unique, but there's so many similarities between what goes on. So hopefully people can take away something from this where they're like, yep, I see myself in this as well. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the funny thing about what we do. And you've been working, on this kind of stuff for a while now, 3 years, I think.
I think more than 4 years.
Yeah, almost 4 years. So, and you've done over 100 of these assessments. And so, I think what you've articulated is true. Every agency basically has one of like 4 problems, but there's always a little bit of nuance, a little bit of, specificity to how that manifests in their particular business based on their team, the services they sell, the market they're in, what their culture is, and so on. And so hopefully we can sort of shed some light on both of those things, both the simple underlying truth, but also how we think about, making that assessment and charting a path forward for that unique firm.
Yeah. And even in situations where the problem is the same, the solution might be different depending on the desires of the agency. I mean, if you have someone who's winding down and wants to sell, that's going to be a different look. This particular one, when I press them on how do you want to approach some of these problems, they're like, let's grow our way out of it. So that's the path we're taking with these guys.
Awesome. Well, with that, let's start with just a high level understanding of client X. They came to us and they had some problems. They had some symptoms that they were feeling in their business that they knew were not positive symptoms. So what were some of the things that this particular firm felt were challenges in their business when we first started speaking to them?
Yeah, so there was a few things. I mean, number one, they felt like they had just gone through iteration of trying to solve their profitability problem. And in the end, they were still losing money. So they knew they had a problem. They just didn't know where the problem was. And I mean, they were coming with pretty specific areas that they thought it might be, health insurance. They thought their health insurance costs were too high. And I mean, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not your biggest problem. But we did take a look at it. But yeah, they were just struggling to identify where the issue even was, and that seems to be pretty common with most of the agencies we work with. Is they know that something's not right, they're not getting the results they want, but they're not sure why. And after they've tried a few things on their own, they'll come to us to do some analysis on that.
And just for some context for everyone listening, roughly where was this firm in terms of headcount, revenue, and when did these profitability problems start to crop up for them in terms of as they grew? Because of course they weren't unprofitable the whole time because they had enough on the balance sheet to fund some losses for some period of time. So yeah, at what point did this kind of set of challenges start to set in for them?
Yeah, I think, well, they were around a headcount of 12. We'll talk about that a bit more later because it's relevant. I can't remember their exact revenue lines. I have to actually go through and look it up. They were close to $1 million, we'll say. But they were losing money. So they were year over year losing, $80,000, something like that. So which is pretty significant on the amount that they were doing. And not sustainable long term. I think they had enough in the bank to carry them for a little while, but they kind of hit a point where they were trying to decide on their next step. Do we hire in order to generate some more revenue and work our way out of the problem that way? Or did they need to cut back? They just weren't sure where to take it next. They just knew something had to change from where they were.
Yeah. And I think this is an important thing to double click on, which is, I think a lot of clients come to us when they're stuck in that kind of a moment where they know that something's wrong, but they don't have enough clarity on what exactly is wrong and how to chart a path out of it. And so they sort of get stuck. And a lot of times the discussions as a leadership team can sour because there's differing opinions and all anybody can agree on is like, we need to do something, but what we need to do is not always necessarily easy to get to or get alignment around. And it sounds like, the sentiment in this case, from what I recall, was still good. They hadn't gotten to that point, but everybody agreed they needed to change something and that they weren't really quite sure how to get to the answer of what to do.
Yeah, and this particular example, they had 2 co-founders, and I've actually worked with another agency that had 4 co-founders. And everyone tends to have their area where they know their stuff and they're focused on, and so that's where they go to figure out their problems. Or if it's not such a positive thing, they'll look at other people and go like, the problem must be out there somewhere. But in any case, there's this siloed view of things. So we're kind of helping open things up, look at things more holistically, and show them where the problems really lie.
Yeah. I have 2 other little questions here, and then we'll start talking about what you did really and what we did as a company to work through that. But you mentioned that they had been trying to solve this challenge for a while. What are some of the things that they had tried or that they had been exploring prior to coming to us?
Yeah, a lot of what they ended up or had started doing was tightening up internal process. Just getting really on top of most of their overhead spending. Building out some project management processes, just getting, everything really tight that way. And when I looked at it, there was a couple spots, but there wasn't a lot of fat in any of that. They had done a really good job cleaning it up, but it hadn't solved the problem. And we've seen that so many times where the first place people go to is their overhead expenses. They're like, oh, wait, maybe if we cut down on our software seats or, whatever. It makes such a small difference in the big scheme of things. But that's what they did. And it helped to some degree, but they still weren't where they need to be.
Yeah. It's such a common story. And unfortunately, a lot of time and energy can go into these really marginal gains, trying to squeeze a couple extra percentage points out of overhead spending. One other thing that you had mentioned was, you had a couple different stakeholders on the executive team. Each of them sort of had their own perspective on what the challenge was, and a lot of that was colored often by where they had the most context or the most expertise. What were some of the sort of leading theses, I don't know if that's the right way to say thesis in plural, but what were some of the leading ideas internally on what might be wrong and where there was maybe some conflicting points of view on the team?
Yeah, so I think there was basically 2 main areas. One was the overhead expenses. So they were looking at how much were they spending on hosting, how much were they spending on health insurance, that kind of thing. And they cleaned that up as much as they could. And then the other side of it was around internal process, especially in terms of project delivery. So there was a lot of time spent trying to figure out, where the gaps were there, what the problems were. But again, well-meaning, well-intentioned, but they weren't starting from the right place. And I mean, there's all the debate around time tracking, but their time tracking wasn't great. And it limited them in how much they could see on that side. So they explored a lot, but they weren't really seeing what they need to see there.
So that sort of frames up the problem, what they came in with, to kind of what they were experiencing, what they were thinking, what they had tried. So let's walk through the process, right? We start working with them. What were some of the first things that you did to start gaining some clarity on where the issues lied?
Yeah, so with all of our assessments, we kind of start at the same place. We look at, what our expectations are, what we call our agency model. Like, we know what people should be spending on delivery and overhead and how much profit they should make and all that sort of thing. So we have these benchmark ideas in mind, so that when we start to ingest their own data, we know where the problems start to show up. And in their case, the first thing we do is we look at their model. So what I mean by that is the way the company is structured, how much they're charging, how much they're paying people. Does it all make sense as a business model? Does this company, are they set up for success? And when we did that, it was almost perfect, to be honest with you. They were spending a little bit too much on admin and almost nothing on facilities. That's fine. Like, you can move your spending around as you need to. But the numbers all worked out. They were supposed to make a 21% profit. It was great. Then we pull in their actual data. So we start looking at their historical P&L, how much were they making month over month, and match that up with how much time they were spending. It's a little tricky because, as I said, their time tracking compliance wasn't great. So we went department by department for these guys to say, okay, talk to me about your design team. We knew how many hours they were modeled to spend, but then we had to ask, like, how busy do they feel? Is anyone doing overtime? Are they spending a lot of time on internal projects they wouldn't normally? And we can kind of, through that line of questioning, figure out approximately where they are. So we had to do some massaging of their numbers to clean that up a little bit and get a good idea of where they were. But once we did that exercise, we realized that they were spending way more on this team than they were able to generate a profit from. And it became really, really obvious when we started looking closely at payroll numbers. And at Parakeeto, we tend to not focus on just that metric. I know you just did a webinar with AMI, and AMI is all about the 55-25-20 model, which is 55% payroll, 25% overhead, and then 20% profit. So I shifted the way that we normally look at things and went that direction. So we looked at it from a payroll perspective. 55% should be payroll. And what we found was they were actually spending 98% of all their money that was coming in was going right out the door to payroll, which obviously doesn't leave them any room to pay for their overhead expenses and make profit. And that's why they were losing money.
Okay, I want to double click on this sort of first. You've kind of talked about the first two phases of the assessment, one being data collection and analysis, and then stakeholder interviews, which tend to take place, in the second phase of the assessment, where, to your point, sometimes if the data isn't that clear or the data is a little bit messy, we can use stakeholder interviews to help us understand what's going on and approximate where someone is and get an accurate insight without necessarily having to have precise data, which is the case for most of our clients. I would say they come to us because they struggle with this. So a lot of clients don't have great or really any time tracking data. Their books might be a little bit messy. So you mentioned compensating for time tracking. Were there any other parts of the data that we had to make some adjustments to or compensate for? For example, payroll adjustments on the P&L, maybe some revenue accrual stuff, some splitting out of accounts, or maybe even some complexity to work through on the team side as it relates to freelancers, contractors, part-timers, or people working across different parts of the business.
Yeah. So if we could glean everything we needed to just from the data, I mean, we wouldn't need to talk to anyone. They could just fill a form in online. It would generate some calculations and we'd be done.
Parakeeto.ai.
Yeah, but it's never like that. We always need that so much more context from them. And in this case, yeah, like the time tracking thing was part of it. Another big part came up when I was analyzing their P&L. There was a prepayment for a project. So they got paid, whatever, $100,000 upfront for work that was still not done. So we had to make an adjustment to reflect the fact that was still on their books. I think otherwise this was a relatively clean one, but most of the time there are any number of adjustments we need to make to reflect the real situation, not just what the numbers are telling us. And yeah, that's what I love. I love going in initially and just looking at straight data, and it starts to tell me something because it gives me a starting point for the conversation. But there always has to be that conversation that comes afterwards to go, okay, tell me what this means. Even when we're analyzing the P&L, really simple things like, hey, there's an amount on here for travel expenses. Tell me what that's for. Is it for your team going to a conference, or is it you traveling to sell something? There's all that information doesn't necessarily show up in their books themselves.
So that's sort of the data collection, the stakeholder interviews. And at the end of that process, generally we've got a lot of clarity on here's the problem. And so you sort of started framing the problem with 98% of their income was going to payroll. And so the next question, of course, is, well, why? Why is that? Was it that they weren't charging enough? Was it that they were over-servicing clients? Was it a utilization problem? So what conclusions did you start to come to in terms of where the levers needed to get pulled to get this company back on track and closer to their model, which you had identified as being actually pretty healthy if everything was going as planned?
Yeah. So there were a few different areas, actually. The first most obvious one was an imbalance in their team between producing people who are generating revenue, and then the overhead people, including the founders of the company. So when it all shook out, they had 2 co-founders, they had some overhead people, like including sales. They had project managers, 2 of them, I think, that were not being billed for. At least not most of it was being, like, there's a lot of client work that they just were not generating revenue from. And then 6 people, half of their team, were left over to pay for everything. So that imbalance created some problems. The other problem was they had an imbalance within the production team of how busy people were. So they had a design team that was just swamped, couldn't keep up with the work. And then they had the rest of the team who were kind of waiting for the design team to get their work done. So that bottleneck just meant you've got a good chunk of the team who are not fully utilized. There was also a pricing issue. So when we do an analysis, we look at how much the team costs them, how much margin we think they need to get on that team cost in order to get the right balance of profit. And they just weren't quite priced high enough for the cost of their team. The cost of the team was pretty normal, at least for North America. But they just weren't charging enough for it. So we had a whole array of ways that we needed to address in order to fill in some of the gap here.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
All right. So you identified a couple of really important things. And one that I think is really important to double click on here is there was a challenge fundamentally with their team structure and their model, in that, they were sort of leaning towards being sort of top heavy and overhead heavy. And the reason I want to double click on this is because earlier you said that one of the things that they had tried to streamline their profitability was cutting overhead. And in particular, they placed a really big focus on getting better at project management, getting better at project execution. And I think that's worth touching on, because this was one of those instances where it's like, no matter how good they got at that, they still would have kept having profitability problems, right? And this is, I think, a really important idea, is a lot of times people conflate a business model problem with execution, where their problem was clearly not execution. In fact, they seem to be really good at execution, all things considered, and made investments to get even better at it. And even if they had continued to make investments there, they still would have kept having these issues that had more to do with how the business was structured. And so I thought that was a really important thing to just pause and acknowledge, because there might be some people out there that resonates with, where they feel like they have, gotten so good at project execution and they're still struggling with profitability.
Yeah, I mean, it can go either way. This was a bit unusual. Usually we don't have major problems on the model side. It's always execution. But until you take a look at things from both angles, you don't really know what's going on.
All right. So you've called out, in this case, team structure, which I think was creating a low utilization ceiling to some degree. It sounds like there was also some utilization challenge there, but it wasn't due to a lack of work. It was due to an imbalance in the team, and in particular, a bottleneck in one particular department. And then the third component sounded like was an average billable rate issue, which was mostly being driven by the way that they were pricing their engagements. So with all of that, how did that manifest into the workshop and the roadmap that got put together for the client? What were some of the sort of recommendations and go forward plans for that client to get things back on track?
Yeah, so all of that helped us, uncover what was going on and be able to identify some of those issues. And when we build out the roadmap, we're looking at the quick wins versus longer term strategic stuff. So we had a few in each, and they kind of stack on top of each other, of course. So in terms of quick wins, we want to get their time tracking to be more accurate. We all had a suspicion that there's more information, more mysteries to uncover, but we weren't going to be able to do that until we had better time tracking data in place. So I gave them some strategies on how to implement that and get some compliance and some coaching tactics around it. And that was sort of one path that we were pursuing while other things were happening. Then there was also, in terms of capturing, how do I put this? It was increasing utilization, but in a very unintuitive way. And that was, they were doing a lot of work, especially on project management, that they were not counting as delivery time. So, and that was mostly project management. And you see it a lot, where I guess they assume that this is just a service that they provide that's going to be baked into their rates, and they don't need to charge extra in terms of hours for it. Account management is the same thing. So we had a whole conversation about what that means and what it should look like, and decided that, yes, we do want to recognize those delivery hours of project management time as delivery time that we should be capturing and measuring and treating as if we should be getting paid for it. Right away, we're going to see a jump in our utilization just by how we measure it, which is useful, but it also means our average billable rate is going to go down. We're still making the same amount of money. We're just adding more hours to it. So there's a whole separate conversation that needs to happen around that, where as we learn more, as we start to recognize the value of that time, we're also going to have to change how we bill. That was a longer term thing. But the big one, of course, is their model utilization. So we uncovered the fact that their team was imbalanced. They had too much overhead for the size of the delivery team that they had. And so that was another part of the conversation was, well, where's your comfort level with this? Is this a situation where we need to cut back on our overhead size, the size of our overhead team? Or are we ready to go ahead and try to solve the problem by growing the delivery side? So just shifting the balance there a little bit. And they were very clear that they want to solve this problem by growing, partly because they had that problem with their design team where they're like overloaded, too much work for the design team. So they had an immediate solution to that by growing, by adding another designer. It was also in the quick win column because it was a decision that they had sitting in front of them that they weren't sure what to do with. In fact, I believe they had paused the decision until they talked to us and worked through this. But once they saw the data, once they saw our recommendations, they immediately posted a job posting to hire that. And of course, the outcome of that will be they bring in a new designer, they start working through that backlog a little quickly, open up some of the work for the rest of the team. The new person is going to increase their model utilization and be utilized because they have this huge backlog, and the rest of the team utilization can start to bump up as well. So kind of solved it twice in the same area there.
And at a practical level, they'll be earning revenue faster as well, which I think is important to note. Yeah.
And then longer term, strategically, once we have better time tracking data from them, then we can start to analyze their ABR by project, by client, by service line, et cetera. And that's going to uncover all kinds of new stuff that we want to take a closer look at. We also talked about longer term a price increase. So I'm working with them right now to understand how they price, how they estimate their projects, but with the mindset of bumping up by, it's not even that much, like 10 or 15% price increase in order to get to the right level where they need to be. And then a couple smaller things that are lower priority things, but training up their PM team on scope management. They felt like there was some areas for opportunity there, and we had a third-party partner that I kind of pointed them to get some help. And yes, we did look at some overhead costs, and we gave them some guidance on where they can look at reducing their health insurance costs. So yeah, that's kind of where we landed with them in terms of the most immediate roadmap.
So it's interesting because you mentioned at the top of the episode, two agencies might have the same problem, but the solution might look different based on their culture, their priorities, their risk tolerance, or their strategy as a business. And I think this is a perfect example of that, where the conventional wisdom would be, oh, you have a utilization problem. Well, usually the fastest and most obvious way to solve that is by making cuts to the team and right-sizing the team to the amount of work that's coming in. But in this case, right, there was some nuance to this particular client where A, they wanted to grow out of it, but B, you also sort of recognize that their utilization could be increased by removing the bottleneck in the way that work flowed through their organization, and recognizing also that the demand was there, which is not always the case for firms, right? But it was sort of the right call in this particular situation. So I think it's a really good example of, a moment where there was nuance to the recommendation based on all the context that was specific to that client, for a metric that, conventional wisdom would say, you handle it this way, you let people go.
Yeah. And I certainly had a few assessments recently where that was the recommendation was, you've got, your team is too big. You're paying for a bunch of people that you're not getting anything from. We need to cut that back, which is not the conversation I'd like to have. But I think I've had a few recently, and I'll give you the setup for it, which is it's not so much that they are just love to grow and they want to grow. It's almost like they're constrained in the solutions that they have. And in almost all these cases, it was they had a layer of leadership, usually co-founders, co-owners, that it's not like anyone was leaving. So they had to figure out, how do we find profitability but keep that leadership group intact and pay them, the amount that they wanted to get paid. So right away it was like, well, we can't cut back on the delivery team because now we have even fewer people to start to help pay for that overhead. So yeah, you kind of have to look at each of these situations within that context, within their own context, to understand what solutions are available.
Yeah. Now, this is a client that has also decided to work with us on a profit management plan. So we'll be working with them on an ongoing basis, measuring their business, and then continuing to work on these initiatives. They'll be getting coaching calls with you on a regular basis. As a consultant, what is your focus when it comes to reporting for them, and when it comes to how you approach the sort of consultative coaching part of the relationship? What's top of mind for you as you support them going forward?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, there are so many places we could hook into, and that changes the relationship of the coaching. What we ended up doing for this particular client is sort of a graduated approach to coaching, which is we're going to spend a few months just sort of helping to educate, helping them to understand what they're looking at, and helping them get their time tracking compliance in place. So we're going to do that for a few months. Once we have good time tracking data, we're going to move up to the next level where we start to look a little bit more deeply at the numbers, help them with their utilization specifically, figuring out how do we plan all of this work? How do we get their project management team in a place where that work is flowing through streaming through nicely? And then finally, after we have all that in place, we'll bump them up so that we're looking at all the time tracking data in a more automated way and digging that one level deeper into what projects are not doing as well as we want, which types of work should we be pursuing or not pursuing, that kind of thing.
I think one of the other important things to call out here is in that step progression, what that sort of inherently lends us toward is all of the focusing really on the leading elements as opposed to starting with the lagging elements, right? So the lagging elements are the things that we're working towards later. And the focus right now is on, I think, the things that precede that. So, the pricing, the forecasting element of this. So like, are we on track to utilize the team? Are we making changes to our team that like improve the model so that the upside that's possible to achieve in the business is good going forward? And so from a sequencing perspective, I think that's important, because it's all of the groundwork that leads to the good lagging indicators later, but it's also stuff that isn't gated by having good time tracking data. Like there's actually a lot we can see, there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot that's measurable, even if we don't necessarily have that stuff in place, which to your point can take a few months to like really get going after you go through all the change management, the compliance, the training, et cetera. So I think from that perspective, it was a good approach that you landed on, just in terms of being able to like focus on what is going to move the needle right now and is not going to be blocked by, some of the operational limitations of the data that they have today.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we could do is just, yeah, like you said, finding those ways to identify what can we impact now. There's a lot of patience involved because we probably want 3 months of time tracking data. So, there's a delay there. We need time to hire a new designer and get them up to speed. We need time to roll out a price increase. All of these things take time. But to your point, we can measure the leading indicators of that model utilization. When they hire that designer, their model utilization changes. When they increase their price, their model average billable rate changes. Like these things we can see and we can model out going forward. So we can say, like, if this is our path, this is what it should look like. And then as the historicals become actuals, or the actuals become historicals, we can start to see the impact of that going forward. But at least we know where we're going with it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the power of making sure that you have both the plan and the actuals in your reporting system, and that you start with the plan first. All right. And together you get a lot more insight out of those things. And I think that sequencing allows for a lot of quick wins. So with all of that, Carson, any final thoughts you want to share on this particular client engagement for those that are listening?
Oh man, like I said at the beginning, every situation is unique, and I love that. I love every time going into it, going, okay, what are we going to find on this one? And there's always something new and different. The other thing I really enjoy is when a client is ready for action, I guess. And this was a client, they're like, do we hire a designer? And as soon as we looked at the numbers and said yes, they put the job posting out. And that gives me a lot of encouragement for whatever comes next. I mean, right now we're working on time tracking compliance. They're working on it. It's going to happen. And I think that's really motivating for both sides. If you're coming into a consulting engagement and you're not ready to turn it into action, you're just not going to see the results of it. So there has to be some kind of attitude of action in order for us to be successful on either side. But yeah, this has been a fun one. We already have a plan that goes out like a year in advance. We know that this is a long-term sort of approach to things. So that patience level is also factored in there. So yeah, everything is just lined up to be a good time here.
Always a good time when you're digging into the numbers and increasing profitability. I am going to take a moment here to do a shameless plug, which is if going through this process and getting these kinds of insights is something that you think would be helpful for your firm, then I want to encourage you to head to the website, click on the apply for a consultation button so we can have a conversation and see if and how we can help take you through this process, get you this level of clarity. And I think especially as we go into the end of the year, it's a really good time to get this kind of clarity, if nothing else, just to get your team on the same page about how you move forward. So I encourage you to reach out if that sounds interesting at all. And with that, Carson, I want to thank you again for taking the time to prepare all of this and just do such a deep dive into how we do what we do. And hopefully it's helpful to all of those that are working on this stuff on their own in terms of their approach and how they look at their numbers, look at their business differently, and hopefully get a little bit more clarity on how to move it in the right direction. Yeah. And I mean, if there is someone listening that wants to jump into an assessment, I really hope you do, because I love every one of them. And I'm looking forward to the next problem. Awesome. All right. Well, with that, thank you for listening and tuning in. If you learned something or if you have questions, reach out. We always love to hear from you, and we will see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.